The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. I'm Niresh Eliathambi. Reforms of state-owned enterprises have been demanded by the public for over a year and a half, if not longer. But we see very little progress to the naked eye. But today, to shed more light on this situation, we have with us Mr. Dhananath Fernando, CEO of the Advocata Institute. Welcome, Dhananath.
Thank you, Niresh.
So, first of all, thank you for coming in during this festive season and all the very best for the season.
Thank you. See you the same.
Now, Dhananath, you're one of the wonderful economists and researchers who has all the facts, and you appear on talk shows like this and in other forums, and you talk a lot of sense, as do our other Sri Lankan economists. But our political leaders, who are the policy makers, seem to pay little heed to your wisdom, and instead they make the most ludicrous decisions sometimes. Can you explain this?
Niresh, it was said in economics the first principle is all resources are scarce. But in politics, the first principle is forgetting the first principle in economics. But to shed more light on that, I think absolutely, I mean, not only me, there are many people who speak about these reforms, the need for reforms, but when it hits the policy, the decision-making circle, there's resistance or reluctance or sometimes ignorance or sometimes even the arrogance. How I see it is, to solve this, there's called this iron triangle in policy, where you have to have all alignments together actually to things get done, because not only the researchers pushing sometimes will not get the reforms over the line. People's support has to be there, people's awareness and their willingness has to be there, and there has to be that window, we call it that Overton window, because when things are changing, sometimes those windows are getting open. So in that window is where the policy reforms needs to take place. Now, for an instance, if you recall the 20th Amendment, I mean, if you recall, there was 18th Amendment, 19th Amendment, 20th Amendment, all those instances, there was that window that somehow it moved for good side as well as bad side. So I think there was a golden window for us after the crisis, because people really felt the difficulty, and of course, it was obvious that the state-owned enterprises reforms and many other reforms were needed if as a country, if we were to move forward. I think unfortunately we haven't capitalized that window, sadly, for our betterment as a country. But I think that we should not discourage, because the only way that we can keep the conversation alive is constantly talking about the reforms and basically speaking sense about what has to happen. And that's the only way that you can get these reforms done. Fortunately or unfortunately, this reform process and this public policy, Niresh, is a long run game, it's a long haul game. Sadly, we cannot, I mean, we are very happy if things can be done quite faster and even overnight, but of course, you know, respecting the democratic values and also getting the people's support, like what we speak in this People's Platform. With that support is where we have to move, because that's the only way we can sustain the reforms. I think one good example is the RTI, the Right to Information Act. Of course, there are loopholes, but there was support, at least there's some level of sustenance in that reform. So likewise, I think the state-owned enterprises reforms also should move forward with the support of people, but I think that all alignment has to happen, but it cannot be like all stars should be aligned to do these reforms, but we have to move quite faster. But that's our role. I mean, everyone has a role. I think what we are trying to do is providing that facts and keeping that conversation alive, so at least these reforms can, you know, at one point it will get over the line.
So the window you were speaking about, I believe, started with the Aragalaya period, which was about 18 months ago. And now is the window closing?
In my view, Niresh, it is slightly closing because it's hitting an election year. So when the election comes, of course, all the political parties comes with, as Lee Kuan Yew famously said, it's a auctioning of non-existing resources in Sri Lanka when it comes to the election time. So all these vested interest parties, they have a demanding power. So in my view, it's slightly closing with the elections coming. If you recall, even in 2019 elections, 2015 elections, it's a very difficult period when it comes to reforms the 6 months before the elections. At the same time, there's again a window opening after the elections, because the first 100 days or the 3 to 4 months where the reforms can be taken place, because that point people have given a mandate for your program and there's another window opening up. So in my view, yes, it's closing in a way, but I think I am hopeful that at least some of the state-owned enterprises reforms will take place. I think the state-owned enterprises, there are two parallel lines of reforms going on. There are selected SOEs are going to reform through the state-owned enterprises restructuring unit, and there are some SOEs which are like networking industry, like the CEB, the CPC and the water board, that is happening parallelly with the ministerial level. So I hope at least if we can get the two bills for the electricity and also the SOE holding company in January, and if we can get it approved, I think that I consider a reasonable victory. But of course, as we know, things can change, because when there's a new government, they can reverse those bills and they can do so many changes. But I'm hopeful that things will move forward. Window is closing, but I think still there's a window. Somehow we can get it through in the first quarter.
Now, Dhananath, you mentioned the CEB, the CPC. Which other entities are we talking about?
So CEB, CPC are basically, that reform process is going with the Power and Energy Ministry, and the other entities are, which is I think identified about 200 and, if I remember right, 189 commercial enterprises, which is coming under state-owned enterprises restructuring unit, if my memory serves right. But out of that, they are considering mainly the Lanka Hospitals, Sri Lanka Telecom, Hyatt Hotel, Litrogas, and Sri Lankan Airlines. I think those are few institutes that they are considering. But I think they have outlined 9, if I remember right, again key principles of this reform process. One is basically, now for an example, if you get Litro, I think they have identified that is a difficult one to reform, because it's pretty much a government monopoly. So if you give it to the private sector, government monopoly becomes a private monopoly, and it doesn't serve the purpose, because in a market economy the consumer is in the center. Whether it's a government monopoly or a private monopoly, the market system doesn't work. So for that, they have to bring a couple of players and make the market competition first, and then get that reform. So I think institutes like those will basically stay slightly, it will take a little bit of time. But I think Lanka Hospitals and the Hilton Hotels, those I think have a higher chance, because it's pretty much open, there's enough competition, there are enough players, and I think there are enough interested investors who are willing to bid and run it. So I think those institutes, I hope it will go first, but the others, I think those principles, with all, I mean, I think we have to say what is right is right. So I think those principles are important, because I think a lot of people have that misperception. This state-owned enterprises reforms is you just give it free of charge or something like that for someone else. It is not. It is establishing the market system. Market system is demand and supply, and government doing their regulatory role, so then the consumer is protected. At the same time, you are getting that competition, so the prices will come down, and at the same time the service will become better. So I think that's the fundamental of this reform, and it has to be based on those fundamentals.
Dhananath, are you happy with the level of transparency in this entire process over the last 1 year or so?
I think there are areas for improvement. I am not like 100% happy, but I think the state-owned enterprises restructuring unit, what they are doing, again, there's I'm not saying it's a conflict of interest. My chairman Murtuza is also a member of the state-owned enterprises restructuring unit, so please keep that in mind. I'm not saying this because he is in the board, but I think informing that, I think the process that they have followed is so far transparent, but I think the challenge would come ultimately with all their recommendation. The final decision has to be made by the cabinet. So what they have said so far is no unsolicited proposals. It has to come through that process, and there's a buyer side due diligence, and there's a seller side due diligence, and the government valuer will also, after those due diligence, there will be bids being called, and it has been on a competitive basis so far. They have advertised, and now for some other institutes this express of interest has been called, and then they will shortlist, and then the bids will be called, and based on those bids they will shortlist, and then the bids will be evaluated from the valuer. So then if there is a discrepancy, then that will be rectified, and then the state-owned enterprises restructuring unit will recommend one or selected institutes to the cabinet. So finally the cabinet has to finally make that decision. I don't know what would be the cabinet do, but I think they have outlined about 9 principles which are pretty much market focused, which I think is the right way to do it. So far I think it's somewhat in that transparent process. But having said that, people always get confused. Now at the same time, while there are state-owned enterprises restructuring going, there are also some unsolicited bids going for other projects. For an example, on the renewable energy side, on some of the other, let's say even few years ago, even for the Colombo Ports terminal. So those unsolicited proposals still coming on. I think that is not definitely transparent, but on those restructuring unit, I think so far still nothing has been done. I mean, as a transaction. So far I think they have only, if they stick to their word that there will be no unsolicited proposal. In fact, in one of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce event, I asked the chairman of the state-owned enterprises restructuring unit, what if, imagine if there are bids, but if there's an unsolicited proposal coming which is actually a better bid, do you still consider? So they said no, it has to come through the process even if it is a better bid than what has been shortlisted. So I think we have to wait and see. So far I think if they can stick to those principles, I think that would be better. But on the other hand, I think there are so many other projects also government pushing without on a competitive basis, which is definitely harmful, and that is not the way to do it.
Right. Let's now cross over for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
Inflation, exchange rates, and the rise and fall of the stock market. Bringing you insights into the business world. Watch the Business Buzz every Tuesday at 9:30 p.m. on TV1.
ඔය කියන්නේ මං ගත්තේ මෝඩ තීරණයක් කියලාද?
හැබැයි හැංගීම්බර තීරණයක් වගේ. හැංගීම්බර වෙලා ගන්න ගොඩක් තීරණ හදිසි තීරණ. හදිසි තීරණ ගොඩක් වෙලාට මෝඩ තීරණ.
ඔයාලා හැමෝම කතා කරන්නේ මට උන දේ ගැනනේ. කවුරුත් කතා කරන්නේ අභිමන් වැටිලා තියෙන තැන ගැන.
අපි අභිමන් වෙනුවෙන් මොනවා හරි දෙයක් කරන්න බලමු.
මට වැදගත් මගේ අභිමන් විතරයි.
මම මේ දවස්වල මගේ සම්පූර්ණ කාලය යොදවලා තියෙන පූජක නඩුව සම්බන්ධව තමයි.
අපිට බලාපොරොත්තුවක් තියාගන්න පුළුවන් වේද?
නීල පබලු අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
You've seen the land wonders of the Paradise Island. Now we take you on a journey beyond the shores, beneath the waves. Sri Lanka's first ocean-related docu-series. mysteries of the ocean floor. Sea of Sri Lanka, 6th of January, 6:30 p.m. onwards.
TV1. TV for life.
Heavy rains cause reservoirs to overflow, prompting flood and landslide warnings in 5 districts. That height triggers price surge across essentials, sparking opposition outcry. Central bank urges policy continuity for financial and economic stability. Opposition leader vows to punish those who ruin the economy in future government. Sri Lankan Airlines privatization deadline extended again.
TV1. TV for life. The People's Platform.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Mr. Dhananath Fernando, CEO of the Advocata Institute. Now, Dhananath, we spoke of it being an election year next year. How do you trim the fat in the state-owned enterprises when the unions within those enterprises are vital for politicians of all hues to run their election campaigns, to organize their rallies, to put up their posters, and so on and so forth? How do you tell these people that they need to go home, or that their institutions are going to be restructured, and that they have to basically work harder?
So, Nilesh, that's why I said the window is slowly narrowing down, because with an election, of course, this is sadly the status of most of the state-owned enterprises. There are unions, and they have been all political. I mean, the cadre has been filled with political appointees, those who have worked for their election campaigns. And these, what we have to remember is, the state-owned enterprises and corruption are pretty much the same thing, because the state-owned enterprises are set up for corruption, and that corruption comes in different ways. It's not all about like a minister taking a commission. It's also about that you are filling a cadre with an unsuitable person, or which doesn't, when there's no vacancy exists, that you are putting a person, is also a form of corruption. So these state-owned enterprises are corruption. If you are saying that you're against corruption, and if you are saying no, the state-owned enterprises has to be floated, those are two contradictory things, because the state-owned enterprises on one side are basically it's a synonym for corruption in my view. So basically on the other side, if someone is saying that we cannot, these taxes are too high, we have to bring down those taxes, again you can't say the taxes has to be brought down and the government should also do businesses, because higher taxes is also, there's a bigger component coming from the state-owned enterprises. So as you very correctly said, these unions, and I mean with all due respect, I think they are doing some, probably these unions and freedom of association has been guaranteed through our constitution, but I think political appointees and basically completely wasting state resources cannot be endorsed by under any circumstances. So the challenge is, one way to look at is, of course, when we do a reform in one of those, selected state-owned enterprises, it doesn't mean that all the cadre has to, or like selected cadre has to go home on the next day. So there are processes that you do. Now, even if you look at on the defense side and many other state-owned enterprises, even in the private sector, there are VRSs being announced. So basically the people have the choice, because I am sure there are people who really can earn a better salary without sticking to that state-owned enterprises, because they have a better skill set. So basically these people will consider that. So then you basically bring down the cadre to an extent, bring it down. And then you go to the next step of maybe merging, or maybe consolidating, or maybe there's a public-private partnership. There can be multiple options of taking care of that, and it can be done on a phase-wise. I mean, you're not asking everyone to leave like overnight. It's like 1 year, 2 year, there can be a period. So you basically slowly bring down the cadre. That's how it has to happen. But I agree with your point that these unions have been all politically motivated. So basically they are the one who are basically sometimes becoming an obstruct for those state-owned enterprises reform. But even I have met them, I have had discussions with them. They also agree in a way that if you do not reform these institutes, they will not also have a future, because this cannot be run in this manner. Because I think the best example is in the recent budget, they have announced 450 billion rupees for recapitalization of the 2 state banks. That is about a 20,000 rupee from each individual. So in this studio, you and I have to contribute 40,000 rupees. If you have a 4-member household, their family has to contribute 80,000 rupees. And that's only 2 banks, and those 2 banks have bad debts because of the Petroleum Corporation and the CEB according to the budget. Now, I'm not saying my numbers, it is in the budget, and that debt is about 1,800 billion. So 450 is just 25% of that. So what's going to happen for the other 527 SOEs? Even the good example is, every time when I meet the Ministry of Finance officials, they ask, what are you talking about this 527 SOEs? The list that they have is 189 or something. Because I got the list many years ago, because these state-owned enterprises have their subsidiaries and sub-subsidiaries. So even it is very difficult to track for someone how many institutes are there. So that's where the challenge is. So I think definitely there has to be a solution. Whoever who comes to power, this is the reality, Niresh. Whoever who comes to power, without state-owned enterprises reforms, there will be no future. And if you are assuring, if everyone, through Aragale and every Sri Lankan have asked for transparency, accountability and less corruption. If you are saying no for corruption, you have to also say no for government for not, government cannot do business. Because if you are saying the government has to do business, then in a way you are saying yes for corruption. At the same time, if you are saying, well, please bring down the taxes, then again you have to say, government, please do not do business, because businesses are supposed to be done on a competitive environment. That's how you increase the efficiency. The other example is, now people are saying, okay, the state-owned enterprises are run by the corrupt politicians, that's why they are loss making. So the profit making ones, are they run by the honest politicians? No. Loss making and the profit making both are run by corrupt politicians. Profit making ones are profit making because they are not in a competitive environment. Most of them are government monopolies, the ones who are making profits, or they are getting preferential treatment from the government even if they are running on a competitive basis. For example, the 2 state banks, of course, all the government accounts, the borrowing, the CPC, or everything goes to those 2 banks. So of course they have to make a profit, even in a competitive environment. Others are basically monopolies. So in a monopoly, I think even some of the government monopolies are making losses. If you are making a loss on a monopoly, it is a serious problem. So that's why I say, if you are saying no for corruption, we have to say no for government doing business.
So 527 state-owned enterprises, that's a staggering number. How many employees is that?
If I remember right, Niresh, it is about 200 to 300,000 employees. So the entire government, what has mentioned in the budget is 1.2 million state workers. I think on the SOEs it's up to about 300 to 400, and we are also trying to find information which is difficult to find. That's the other challenge, because these annual reports haven't been published, so we don't know how many people are working. So this is just a ballpark figure, which is, maybe I have to correct that. Just keep that in mind. But that's the source. Even it's not me, even the Minister Vijay Sekara said in the parliament, if I remember right, I think for CEB the required card is about, I think, 5,000 to 10,000 people. They have, I think, 21,000, and he has asked to develop a proposal to bring it down to 10,000 or 5,000, and they have given a proposal to increase it to 28,000. So that's it's not me, it's the minister who says it. So you can imagine the inefficiency which is penting up in these institutes. So without reforming those, there is no future. And also what we need to realize is, especially on CEB and CPC, Niresh, we all know the world is moving to a renewable energy. The battery storage, the solar power, that's where the world is. I mean, with that we have to of course the petroleum usage will slowly come down. And are we considering that our petroleum corporation or the CEB to come and set our battery storage and all that in moving forward by running these institutes? Of course it will take some time, but if we are serious about this renewable energy and cutting down our fuel, because out of our imports 35% is fuel imports. So if you really want to bring the import cost down, you have to do it through fuel. So you have to have efficient fuel usage in the country if you want to really bring down the imports. No point like trying to bring down the imports from cutting down these oranges and cheese and all that. Those are things, protein content that people will eat. So if you really want to bring it down, it has to from the fuel. And to do that, to bring the fuel imports down, you have to have more renewable energy and other options. So to that the government cannot run that business. It has to run on a competitive environment with the private sector.
Food for thought indeed. And I'm afraid we are out of time tonight. Thank you very much to Mr. Dhananath Fernando, our guest tonight. Please stay tuned for the news which is coming up next. Have a good evening.